It's on? Okay, super.
I also remember last year I had the Google Doc of the resources. Yes. So you can share this again. I updated it a little bit, but it's the same.com and then /AS. Which you can share later. I'm not going to talk about the stuff on there per se. I just want people to like have it after. Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody. And for the first time, we are saying good morning to everybody in the world via our live stream cam. Hello, everybody. Say hello to everybody. There we go. Hello. Just right behind you, there are actually two cameras, one here in the back, or on the east wall here, one on the west wall. And this is our inaugural adventure into live streaming in this space. And we couldn't be more delighted to have our guest speaker today be our inaugural speaker. Before I introduce her, I'll share with you that the reason why we have two cameras is that when it comes time for a more interactive component to the conversation, like questions or comments from the crowd, we have two angles by which we can then allow folks at home to be able to see who is saying what. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to just get used to, okay, is that we want to make sure that when we have questions or comments that we remember to use the microphone. So we have a second microphone that today I'll play runner for, okay, so that when it comes time to give comment or have questions and that sort of thing, just be patient just for a split second so I can get to you. That way the folks at home can hear your full question or thought. Is that agreeable? And then we'll see how much we can pull this into our muscle memory right from the get-go to do this. We are extremely delighted to have as a second offering, if you will, Dr. Liora Halperin, who is Professor of International Studies and History at University of Washington and Distinguished Chair, I believe, of Jewish Studies. She can give further nuance to her titling, but she is one of our own, right here local, who is giving a wonderful presentation today on anti-Semitism as part of our Summer of Palestinian Visibility 2.0 experience this summer. And so without any further comment, we just invite Dr. Halperin to come forward, and we thank you for being here.
Okay, well, hello everybody who's here and is in the wider viewing audience, wherever you may be. Can everybody hear me okay? A little soft, okay. Does that mean I should talk louder or that the mic should be turned up? Okay, I'll just talk louder for now. Anyway, it's great to be back. I was actually here just almost exactly a year ago to the day. I was here on August 17th of last year. And I was invited back to kind of do a reprise of this talk I had done before. It's great to be part of this community. My son attends Green Lake Elementary. We live on the other end of that zone down in Wallingford, but nonetheless, I'm in this area all the time. So it's great to speak to this community. So as was the case last year, I really want to be here to answer your questions. Some might be questions that come out of what I say. Some might be questions that come out of what you're upset that I didn't say, or there might be other stuff on your mind. So I hope you'll consider me a resource both today and in the coming months. As you know from my title, this is something that I think a lot about professionally as well as personally. I'm a professor at UW. I teach courses about the history of Israel-Palestine, about the history of Jewish-Muslim relations, which is also always inherently also about Jewish-Christian-Muslim relations. And I'm involved in a whole variety of different sort of communal and broader settings in which these issues are at play, including within the Jewish community. So I think it might seem to folks who are trying to situate themselves as people engaged in the Palestine cause, but also people, rightfully concerned about not encouraging or promoting anti-Semitism, that there's a lot of disagreement out there about how anti-Semitism is defined, particularly around where that category intersects with the space of Palestine activism. And you also might be noticing that there's a lot of disagreement among Jews. So I want to talk through some of my own thoughts about it, which are going to be admittedly very partial, but also to maybe offer some framings and some resources to help folks continue to have those conversations, whether amongst yourselves or with your friends and colleagues in the Jewish community. So despite the fact that there is, in fact, indeed, a lot of disagreement about whether, where, or to what extent pro-Palestine activism might be anti-Semitic or might not be, I think it's important to start by noting that basically everyone who cares about fighting anti-Semitism agrees on the core of what anti-Semitism is. And I'm taking a definition from Trua, which is a progressive rabbinic organization. which defines the core as anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, hatred, or violence against Jews as Jews. At its core, anti-Semitism sees Jews as a nefarious and corrupting presence within society or within the world, okay? Hatred against Jews as Jews is really key. And also the idea that Jews are bad actors, right? Whether locally or globally. So many of you know that what we call anti-Semitism today has a long history and dates back to something that often is called anti-Judaism as opposed to anti-Semitism, and you all probably know that it's deeply enmeshed in its origins in Christian supersessionism, right? The idea that Christianity builds on or takes the torch from and ultimately surpasses Judaism. And it evolved into a modern political ideology that blurs between religion and race, and also increasingly takes on conspiracy theories. Anti-Semitism draws on a wide pool of stories and themes about Jews, about who Jews are, right? What they do, what they want, how they're connected to each other, how they're connected to power. They get pulled to the surface at different times in different places by different people and for different reasons, right? So it's a very fluid and amorphous thing that can sort of be endlessly flexible in accommodating itself to different types of grievances that groups might have. So today, the most visible and powerful Jewish-led entity in the world is the State of Israel. And it's undertaking what increasing numbers of human rights organizations and others have called a genocide, even after the ceasefire of approximately a year ago. Israelis, in turn, are still nearly 3 years later kind of living in this aftermath of October 7th, which they continue to experience not in the 3 years of violence that the state inflicted following, but as this unique, day-long, brutal, violent shock, and continue to live within that vulnerability that that single day produced. That vulnerability has led to increasing perceptions of anti-Semitism, right? The sense of vulnerability and weakness. And some have been inclined to see aspects of pro-Palestine protest or anti-Israel protest as spaces where anti-Semitic attitudes come to the fore. And so it's not that surprising, given all this, that today it's discourse around Israel that becomes a prime space for expressing concerns about anti-Semitism, or for some, and I would argue it's a minority, but it's not zero, for expressing anti-Semitic ideas. As we think about the two big camps of people, and I would say in the Jewish community, trying to evaluate the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel or anti-Zionism, I see two broad camps, and it's actually more complicated than this, but this helps us understand the lay of the land. So one of these camps tends to see anti-Semitism underlying much or most pro-Palestine activism. And it's particularly sensitive to the way that the criticisms of Israel's structural or long-standing violence against Palestinians or discriminatory legal structures tends to call into question the premise that Israel's creation was a good and justified thing, and that Israel is the only and the necessary expression of Jewish self-determination. So the perception is anyone who would call that into question is denying to Jews the kind of respect that any group of people should have, and therefore is motivated by anti-Semitism. Some of you might know of a definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism by a European group, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which initially put this together sort of as a loose working definition, but for various reasons, has sort of like been taken to places it was not necessarily originally intended to go. That definition presumes that things like calling Israel's legitimacy into question or comparing it to regimes that are widely regarded as illegitimate, like the Nazis, or accusing Israel of racism, or giving outsized attention to Israel over other groups, is likely to be motivated by anti-Semitism. Now, the definition is a little bit more vague. It says may be anti-Semitism, but the way that it's being applied tends to operate on the presumption that that's what's going on. And there are campaigns which are still ongoing. Some have been successful, some have not, to get countries, states, cities, institutions to adopt this definition to structure its policy towards especially pro-Palestine protesters. So this is one sort of sphere of thinking that if you even just take a little time looking, you're going to find people expressing. The other perspective presumes that pro-Palestine activism and criticism of Israel more generally is not primarily motivated by anti-Semitism, but rather motivated by evidence-based critiques of this specific state, its historical and current policies, and the effects of those policies. So this is the view, of course, that's common on the left and in pro-Palestine movements and in left-aligned parts of the Jewish community. I think it's possible to exaggerate both of these two views and assume that the former just assumes that all pro-Palestine activism is anti-Semitic, and that the latter assumes that pro-Palestine activism is never anti-Semitic. I think that's an exaggeration. It's actually much messier in practice, and it merits, kind of getting to know the people that you're actually talking to. So those who see anti-Semitism in pro-Palestine protests sometimes will say, well, not all protests are anti-Semitic. But it is the case that they, since really the 1970s, led by organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and some others, have conceptualized what they call the new anti-Semitism, which tends to view pro-Palestine protest as one of or the most important space in which anti-Semitism is expressed. And in any case, seems to assume bad faith and sinister motives within pro-Palestine action or activity. And most importantly, within the Trump administration, there are people in positions of influence who have wholeheartedly accepted that framing and that definition. And it matters less that they think or believe one way or the other. It matters that the force of the state, through surveillance, through efforts at deportation, have operated based on this kind of assumption, right? If they look for anti-Semitism in pro-Palestine protest and then act to discipline, fire, remove, deport, depending, right, this gives this kind of framing incredible power, an incredibly destructive power. Folks engaged in raising awareness about Palestinians and Palestine have come, unfortunately, and I think in a terrifying way, have come to expect this kind of scrutiny. And it's not fair, right? It's not right. At the same time, it's still important pragmatically within the pro-Palestine movement, just like any movement, to root out any instances of real anti-Semitism that can creep into that activism. But it's also important to be aware that how many bad faith charges are likely to be made, and to be careful that one isn't overly careful, that is inclined to comply in advance and say, oh, of course, we won't say anything lest we say something that might be criticized. And over the years since I spoke to you last time, there have been some court cases brought by Jewish-led organizations kind of trying to suppress Palestine speech that have been thrown out by the courts. So one of the prominent ones was a case brought against MIT. The case argued that pro-Palestinian protesters had created a hostile environment, but the First Circuit in Massachusetts dismissed the case, saying that the protests were protected speech. So there's right? We might have started this year with a sense like, oh my God, everything's trending in the wrong direction. Now it seems like the legal system might in fact be making this distinction, at least sometimes, and producing some precedent that other cases can draw on. I think it's also possible to exaggerate about pro-Palestine movements, and this, is a very sensitive thing to say as a Jewish American. Sort of to want to suggest that pro-Palestine protests categorically cannot be anti-Semitic. And I think as charges of anti-Semitism are being weaponized to deport people and dox them and shut down student clubs, the perception that anti-Semitism is being weaponized can lead these groups, our groups, to be defensive and say none of this is true. It's all bad faith. But I still think it's important to realize that people advocating for Palestinians do not want to be anti-Semitic, do not believe that they're anti-Semitic, and are, for the most part, interested in learning, right? Like, what is it that's out there in the air that I want to kind of be careful about? What distinctions do I need to make sure my engagement and activism is doing what it needs to do and not getting distracted by claims that it could be avoiding? This is a climate that we're operating in, or at least an aspect of the climate. The fact that you invited me to speak and invited me to speak again means that you're really interested in thinking about this seriously. As you might assume, of those two positions that I just presented, I share the second of those. I view pro-Palestine activism, right, overwhelmingly as rooted in demonstrable evidence of oppression and violence, and now genocide. I view it as motivated by the real desires for Palestinian safety and collective justice, and just as justified as protests against any state that is committing violence against a group of people. And I also take the position, which is common on the left, that anti-Semitism, though it has unique historical features, operates in tandem with other kinds of hatred. So activists, and particularly Palestinian activists, and especially those who are not US citizens in this country, are caught in a bind. They know, and they say correctly, that they would be feeling the same oppression and the same imperative to fight against it, regardless of who the oppressor was, right? They draw parallels to other world struggles where the oppressor was not Jewish, but continually feel that their attempt to fight this or get policy to be changed gets them ensnared in accusations of anti-Semitism and allows their critics a powerful tool to silence them. Still, we have to tread carefully. Protesting Israeli policy or actions, just like protesting any powerful actor, moves us very quickly to talking about power and the effects of power. It encourages us to talk about how this actor is enmeshed in networks of support, is enabled by transnational flows of money or political support or weapons. And all of these claims, power, networks, money, impunity, right? This is the bread and butter. This is what has been applied to Jews for hundreds of years, including and especially in periods where Jews did not have the political power in the form of a state. So you can see how it gets really, really tricky, right? Talking about the very things that we might want to talk about when we talk about power means that we're talking about precisely the sorts of things that have been lobbed against Jews historically. So anti-Judaism, if we go back even before the modern era, emerged in a setting where Jews did not have the power of a nation state. Jews were a religious minority everywhere they lived, including in Christian lands and Muslim lands. In the early Christian view, Jews had denied the truth of Christ, and if they couldn't be convinced otherwise, which is always like the first line of hope, well, maybe we can convert them, but if they don't, maybe are deserving of some type of degradation or lower status. Jews were also disproportionately transnational and mobile in a way that challenged the stability of territorially based groups. Part of this was that they were excluded from land-based professions and guilds, And part of it is because their diasporic networks, right, their migration since ancient times had made them really well suited for jobs that required transnational connections like commerce. With the rise of capitalism, transnational networks became major assets. So Jews who were in positions to benefit from the system were well placed, right? A small number of them did phenomenally well and became sort of symbols of that kind of success. But many more Jews were scraping together a poor or working class income by doing much more low-level work, but nonetheless kind of mobile and sometimes transnational work. So one way or the other, whether Jews were the wealthy ones or Jews were the poor ones, they were becoming symbols of modern capitalism, right? And if people didn't like it, plenty of people didn't like it because of the way the system destabilized all sorts of long-standing systems and relations, looking at Jews and saying it's their fault was a sort of logical, maybe not logical, but we can understand why it happened. As the capitalist system grew, nationalist thinking also grew, and there's a relationship between these two things, really starting in the 17th century, but really as we get into the 18th and 19th century. And as national identity rose, it rooted identity and group identity not in belief, we all pray the same way, we all believe the same way, but in race and ethnicity and ancestry. The idea that Jews were some kind of racial other is not totally modern. Right? Jews themselves had an ethnic notion of who they were, transmitted through families and lineages. But the rise of secular nationalism, race science, kicked this thinking into really high gear. And if Jews were racial others, they remained so even if they converted, even if they assimilated, and maybe especially so, because then they could hide, right? And like do their nefarious, damaging stuff unseen or unnoticed. So Jews became victims of anti-Semitism during a period in which, as a group, they lacked political power, but during which they were perceived to have other kinds of power, whether the power of the market or the power of connections that people maybe desired for themselves, maybe they feared. And also at a time that groups were really anxious about whether they could unify and establish the kind of political systems that were going to work for them. Not incidentally, the same forces that spawned nationalism and nationalist anti-Semitism also produced Zionism, right? We're talking about the 1870s, the 1880s, where this stuff really kicks into high gear. This is the same moment that Jews living in these realities started thinking, well, I guess we're a nation too. Like, what does that mean for us politically? How do we realize our own aspirations? Anti-Semitism is rooted in the sense that Jews, as Jews, have special power or influence and that they're using it in nefarious ways. I said that before, I'm saying it again. And that means that anti-Semitism emerges in greater force in periods of instability, inequality, and feelings of lack of control, right? When people feel that they don't have control over their lives or their destinies, this is a theory that tells them that there is a logic, that there is a source of control, and that source of control is Jews, right? You might think it's chaos. No, it's not chaos. There's actually a method to the madness, and the method is Jews controlling things or operating to orchestrate things. And it always draws on the fact that some small numbers of Jews do have power, right? Whether in the finance realm, media, government, and of course now in the state of Israel itself, right? And these become, right, the things to which people can point their fingers and say, look, right, this is the power system that's keeping us all down. So it doesn't invent power where no power exists. It sees the power of a small number of Jews and connects that power to all Jews as Jews. And so it sees the harms that that power creates as distinctly Jewish and distinctly dangerous. Okay, and when we start to understand how that works, we can start to think about, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to think about how to critique that power, critique those structures without lapsing into thinking it's Jews as Jews and all Jews? Okay, even if in fact, right, the state is the Jewish state and it's led by Jews. So this is very careful work that we have to do. This is a period in which lots of different Jewish groups are noting that there's a rise of anti-Semitism. And it's partly because multiple marginalized groups of Americans, that is non-Jewish Americans, are feeling a lack of control. Right? Some are being brutalized by police violence and poverty, or declining wages, or a sense that things aren't as good as they used to be. Right? Which of those it is going to depend on race and location and other factors. This kind of response, right, that the powerful are acting not in my interest, is a populist response. It's saying the people need something and the systems of power aren't providing it. There's left-wing populism, there's right-wing populism. But although right now the right-wing varieties are far more represented in our political establishment. So anyone suspicious of powerful people in general might focus on a few Jewish politicians or media people and say, it's the Jews, right? So we need to be very careful. We can't just assume, oh, it's only a right-wing thing. No, we can find it anywhere in which people are disaffected and have grievances. So Palestinians, at least in Palestine, aren't operating within this like American setup, but of course are profoundly disempowered. Right? Even after the so-called ceasefire of almost a year ago, most Palestinians, especially those under Israeli occupation, are experiencing an utter lack of control. In Gaza, they're dying of still bombs and also medical and humanitarian neglect. In the West Bank, you may be following this, whole villages are being antagonized and displaced, and feeling like despite a quite vocal global movement, nothing seems to help, right? This kind of experience for Palestinians can also give rise to a search for conspiracy, right? How can it be that so many people are against this and yet nothing's happening? There must be something more powerful that's going on. Because the people directly controlling Palestinians are all Jews and are very adamant about being Jews, it's not very hard to default to theories about Jewish control that draws on hundreds of years of theories about Jewish control. Okay, so if we see Palestinians speaking in ways that seem to default to those theories, right, we can start to understand like how it emerges. Now, that doesn't mean that it's okay. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't say, well, I know your grievance is against the state, and let's really like legitimize that grievance and talk about it. But we can understand how it happens. There's another kind of flip side of this kind of anti-Semitism, thinking that Jews, so if what I've discussed so far is the idea that Jews are uniquely nefarious, controlling things behind the scenes or right out in the open, there's another phenomenon that I want to talk about that's called philo-Semitism, which is a different and opposite way of thinking that Jews are different than other people. Philo-Semitism, philo like love, right? That's the belief that Jews have unique good powers, right? That they have special powers, that they have special influence, but that's a good thing, right, that can support, certain political groups, right? So we see philo-Semitism among certain evangelical Christian groups that say, oh, Jews are so powerful, and we need to harness that power and support that power because it's going to help us, right? Or it's going to help the like broad divine plan, or however it might be. Jews have this special power. A lot of the current administration in the US are philo-Semites, right? They say, we love Jews. right? If you ask them, they say, oh yeah, we love Jews. We love them. And we need to be really careful about that. Even though for certain Jewish groups who like those policies, they just want to bask in that attention, say, yes, yes, of course, like we are indeed wonderful, like please partner with us. But we need to be really careful because philo-Semitism is actually a type of anti-Semitism. And I'll tell you why, right? Because the antidote to anti-Semitism is not deciding that Jews are amazing, right? It's deciding that Jews are normal, they're just people, right? The opposite of saying Israel is uniquely nefarious and evil is not to say Israel is the most moral, most civilized country in the whole world. Or that true Jews are, or on the other hand, right, if one group is going to say, true Jews are inherently nefarious and evil, the opposite is not true Jews are inherently peaceful, right? Jews are inherently wonderful, right? It's to do something called de-exceptionalizing. So saying Jews are not uniquely anything in particular at all, right? Jews are humans. Jews in power are humans in power. And some humans in power do horrible, even genocidal things, right? No one is inherently predisposed to doing horrible things, and no one is inherently immune from it, right? Jews are not specially incapable just because of being Jews, but they're not somehow predestined to it. So to get to this place where we try to de-exceptionalize, both against sort of the lovers who love too much and the haters who hate too much, is to fight against the claim of uniqueness, right? Jews are not uniquely good, Jews are not uniquely bad, but some regimes are uniquely bad, some individuals are uniquely bad, some systems are uniquely bad, and we can name that, we can talk about that, without doing that move, which is Jews as Jews. Right? Jews as Jews must be good, must be bad. So these are debates that are very, very live in the Jewish community today. This is the last thing I want to say before I kind of open up and see where you want to take the conversation. So these debates about, what do we make of anti-Semitism, who's doing it, where does it come from, are very, very live in the Jewish community today. And so it's important that nobody conclude that all Jews believe X, right? There are some Jewish organizations, especially the most vocal ones, that really, really want people to believe that all Jews believe what they believe. But increasing numbers of opinion surveys among American Jews have pushed back against that. I'll just give you some recent statistics. A survey by the Jewish Federations of North America, which is a very mainstream organization among sort of establishment Jews, found that only 37% of American Jews identified as Zionists. Smaller numbers identify as non or anti-Zionist. So it's just 8% who identify as non-Zionist, 7% as anti-Zionists, but 48% didn't identify with any of these categories. So there's a lot of flux, right? And then you drill down and ask, well, what do you mean by Zionism? What do you mean by anti-Zionism? And it gets even messier, right? There's a lot of uncertainty about what this association or connection means, and it's certainly not settled yet. Among younger Jewish Americans, 32% of Jews between 18 and 34 years old identify as either non or anti-Zionists. So in the general group, it's just 15% in one of those two categories. It more than doubles among younger Jews, so folks who might be my students at the university if they're Jewish. In terms of perceptions of Israel's policies, there's also major, major splits. So an October 2025 poll put out by the Washington Post found that 39% of American Jews, so nearly 40%, believe Israel has committed genocide in Gaza, and 61%, a majority, believe it has committed war crimes. And again, these numbers are higher among younger Jewish Americans. At the same time, the most visible, kind of long-standing, sometimes we call them legacy Jewish organizations, are very visibly Zionist. and sometimes see those kinds of positions, non-Zionism, using the word genocide, as evidence of anti-Semitism. It means that you have some Jewish organizations looking at other Jews and saying they're anti-Semitic, which, as you can imagine, is a very messy thing for Jews to be calling other Jews anti-Semitic, but it's happening in very repeated major ways. So a lot is in flux right now, right? It has not settled. Right, these numbers are shifting. You drill down and you do interviews with people, and people are confused. They're like, well, some people aren't. Some people have really figured out where they stand, but other people are like, I don't know where I stand. In some cases, that lack of certainty leads to defensiveness. So that's also something that you might encounter among Jews who are like, I want to be a good person, but I don't even know anymore, where I'm supposed to stand. And so, this is, for those of you who are not Jewish in this, in this community, but in community and conversation with Jews, keeping all of this in mind as you have these contexts is going to be really, really important. It's going to help you understand how to find allies in the Jewish community who share your commitments to Palestinian visibility, which I see you're kind of calling this series. Also to be aware of where anti-Semitism can creep into these conversations, and to be very, very mindful of not making statements about Jews as Jews, but rather targeting our statements and our comments to the actual objects of our criticism. But it's not easy, right? So it's important to keep being self-critical and aware of how these conversations are going. So that's all I have to say for you today, but I'm curious for your questions.
Okay, we'll go to Rich right here.
Hello. Thank you.
Oh, yes, there you are. Okay.
Thank you. Bad knees, so I'm not going to stand. Thank you very much. It was incredibly informative. And as a member of Bet Olive Synagogue, as well as here, I can tell you much of what you said reflects the population that I know. I did have a couple of questions, when you were in your earlier history. One of which is in the founding of Zionism, how the Dreyfus Affair and then Theodore Herzl fit into this. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, since the area of the world we're talking about is the Middle East, what has the history of Mizrahi Jews, mm-hmm. Arab Jews, mm-hmm. been in this? Because it is different than the Christian West.
Yeah. Okay, so one question is about Mizrahi Jews, and the other is about the Dreyfus Affair and Zionism. Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar, the Dreyfus Affair is an affair that begins in 1890 and then stretches on for years, really through much of the decade, in which a Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus is accused of passing army secrets to the Germans. And he's imprisoned, and his cause becomes this hugely divisive thing. Sort of as he's being tried, he's eventually convicted, with pro-Dreyfus people saying he's been framed, right? This is evidence of people who are trying to destroy our liberal French state. And the anti-Dreyfus people saying this guy is evidence of, Jewish attempts to undermine our whole society. And it became a proxy debate, really, about whether France was a place that could accommodate difference, or whether it was a place that was being infiltrated and destroyed by Jewish outsiders. Eventually, Dreyfus was exonerated. So it was realized that he, in fact, had not committed the crime that he was accused of, but he had spent 8 years in prison at that point. So one of the people who was present covering the whole affair was a young journalist, originally from Budapest and then in Vienna, who then came to France, named Theodore Herzl, who became the founding ideologue of the Zionist movement. And there's some theories that experience of seeing so many people turn against this guy and say really horrible things about Jews in France made him feel like there's no future for Jews in France, and maybe by extension for Jews in Europe generally. That's just one piece of the story, right? The vast majority of Jews who ended up joining the Zionist movement in the decades that followed were actually from Eastern Europe, where a combination of economic factors and other political stuff was much, much more important than anything going on in France. So wouldn't put too much weight on that, but it's definitely part of the moment that's producing doubts about whether Jews are going to have a future within Europe. Which I guess brings up your second question, which is about the Jews who did not live in Christian-dominated societies. I teach a class, I think I mentioned, about Jewish-Muslim relations. I teach it in the spring. I don't know if any of you are Access students at UW, but if that's a thing that you do, in the spring quarter this year, if you want to sit in, I'd be happy to have you. It's a different story. Jews, for the most part, are not the only minority in Muslim societies. There's often Christians in those societies too. And because they're not the only minority, they're not singled out in the same way. Also, Islam does not have the same deeply fraught relationship to Judaism that Christianity does, right? It's not founded on, kind of having this new revelation that has displaced Judaism in quite the same way. So overall, the experience in those countries is a lot more stable. But things break down in a really dramatic way in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of Arab nationalism and the founding of Israel. And in the few years between the late 30s and the end of the 40s or the early 50s, huge kind of anti-Jewish movements begin in those countries, which lead most of those Jews to end up departing, mostly for Israel. So for many of those Jewish communities in Israel or elsewhere, sort of the last memory they have of living under Muslim society is of a pretty nasty, right, kind of, with streams of anti-Semitism. And that, in a lot of ways, has colored the narrative in ways that aren't really representative of the whole history, but reflect how much of a shock it was as these long-standing communities kind of came apart in a span of just a few years.
Okay. Susan?
I'm not sure how relevant this is. The Northwest is known as the none zone, where people are not affiliated with any sort of religion. How do Jews identify themselves as religious or secular, and how does that impact society's view and their own communal view of themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have at the tips of my fingers the statistics, although there have been Jewish community surveys in this area that you probably can find online. One thing that's true, I think, of this region as much as other regions is that, over the 20th century, major decline of Jewish observance among Jewish communities. And increasing alignment, not along lines of practice, but around connection to Israel. So connection to Israel became a way that a lot of Jews who were not otherwise practicing sort of came together to be in community, to celebrate. There were other things too, like the Soviet Jewry movement in the 70s and 80s into the 90s was another thing. But, Israel became one of the causes that drew Jews together. It almost became a religion, became almost like the religion in place of a religion. To such an extent, and people joke about this, that there are plenty of synagogues where you can come in and say, I don't observe Shabbat, I don't keep kosher, and the rabbi will say, oh, that's okay. But if you say, I'm not a Zionist, or I don't support Israel, they'll say, I don't know, that's a bridge too far, right? Right, it just shows how much heresy has attached to Israel views, even more than it attaches to things that we consider more sort of traditional space of heresy. So I don't know kind of where I'm going with this, except to say that a lot of non-religious Jews feel very, very passionate about these issues, and the same is true for Jews who have become very critical of Israel. Some are religious, and a lot more are secular, and it comes out of a sense of communal identity, of culture. Some will connect it back to their religious practice, but not always. There's a couple of...
As a longtime member of Kadima, which you probably know.
I knew I recognized you.
And for those who don't know Kadima, it was founded in the late 70s by Jews, mostly not from Seattle, more like the East Coast, finding that when we got to Seattle, you got to find some Judaism even though you're not affiliated. And so they formed together because they had similar political beliefs, like against the invasion of Lam. Oh, well, anyway, I won't say more than I need to, but a rabbi was arrested in D.C. at the beginning of the war for protesting in the Capitol. So many rabbis in organization, they pulled together, calling themselves Rabbis for Ceasefire. In October, when it first began, when we saw that this, retaliation from Israel was far more than a retaliation, and so, so in this past year, because so many members of Kadima, old and new, disaffiliated from Israel, from Zionist identity, if they had it at all, because it was formed more as a political, progressive Jewish organization. It has become reconstructionist. Anyway, point being that our debate was not, if you're anti-Zionist, you shouldn't become a member of us, but maybe it's the Zionists that shouldn't become a member of us, and maybe we should call ourselves the anti-Zionist congregation of Jews. So it just runs the gamut. I'm also, as you're speaking, it occurred to me that where Jews banded around Israel finding an identity, I think that young Jews of Jewish origin but unaffiliated, totally assimilated ancestry are now finding their Judaism as saying, I'm Jewish and I'm anti-Zionist, and they're forming together for Jewish Voices for Peace, and if not now, and standing together and all these.
It's very interesting. What is your name, by the way?
Devorah, nice to meet you. Glad to have you here.
It is very interesting. So one of the outcomes, let's say starting in mid-20th century, of this really close association between Jewish communities and Israel is that Israel made its way into ritual practice in a lot of synagogues. So some synagogues started putting like Israeli flags like on the bima, like on the sort of platform in the front of the synagogue. Some would introduce prayers within the liturgy for the state of Israel. And it's that sort of thing that Jews who, are feeling less comfortable, they say, well, I don't feel comfortable in those synagogues, and start creating communities that create rituals that do the opposite, which is sort of bring awareness of Palestinians or pray for Palestinians in the context of the prayer services. Now, I've heard some people say, like, why do we need any of this stuff in the services? Maybe we should just sort of do the traditional liturgy and then have our political conversations outside, like in the social hall afterwards. These are all divisions, but it just shows how much there's been a reaction that's led Jews to say we need our own communities, we need new communities and new institutions to feel like our synagogues reflect our values.
Sherry?
Hi. A couple of weeks ago, we had another speaker, and someone spoke up and said, Arabs or Palestinians are also Semitic people. And it seems to have gotten lost in the discussion.
Yeah.
Also, I'm wondering if there is any indication that Jewish communities recognize that Christians have been in that territory and they're being persecuted also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a really common comment, which is, well, Arabs are Semites too, and so therefore can't be anti-Semitic if they're Semites, or other things get said. I mean, a few things to say. One is that the term anti-Semitism was coined in the 1870s in Germany in a context where the only Semites around were Jews. Maybe there were a few Arabs, but when they were talking, they being the Anti-Semites League, founded by Wilhelm Marr in Germany in 1873, when they were talking about being anti-Semites, they were talking about Jews. Like, that's what they meant. And the fact that, the race scientists at the university said, well, there's some other Semites too, was sort of besides the point. So the term anti-Semitism came into being to describe hatred of Jews and not hatred of Arabs. And it's almost just like a little interesting asterisk that doesn't, to my view, have any political importance. Like, it's not a gotcha comment in the way some people think that it is, but it is true that the idea that Jews are Semites is related to ideas of race science, that people are divided by race, that Jews are lesser than, and implied in that is that Arabs are also lesser than, and we can remember that, right, that that's part of the history. There was another part to your question that I'm... Oh, about Christians, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of briefly making that point about Jews living under Islamic rule. Christians were also living under Islamic rule and have had some of the same kind of trends. Like, there's Christian nationalisms that have emerged within what had been the Ottoman Empire, efforts to become political. If you think about a lot of the post-Ottoman countries like Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, these were Christian nationalist movements that were organizing politically on the basis of being Christians. And sometimes there's a lot of anti-Islamic or Islamophobic rhetoric that went into that. At the same time, right, when Israel comes into control of this group of Christians, that power, right, sometimes gets deployed against Christians too. And for Israel, it matters less that they're Christians and more that they're Palestinians, right? So, and sometimes Christians find themselves between a rock and a hard place, that especially when they were living under Hamas, which was an Islamist group, the fact that they were Christians was really a liability, and they received persecution from that direction while also being persecuted by the violence of the occupation. So you have multiple groups trying to say, well, who are you really an enemy of, right? Are you an enemy of Hamas? Are you an enemy of Israel? And it was tricky. They were sort of not in a good place with either of those power structures. Yes, somebody in the back?
I actually am going to.
Yeah, go.
So I'm glad you brought up, well, tertiarily, certainly Christian nationalism as a concept, but certainly here in the United States, with the rise of white Christian nationalism specifically, which isn't a new thing, by the way, obviously, but this is that pendulum swing. It's becoming, again, more visible and that sort of thing. I was struck by kind of the parallel, a potential parallel, and maybe you can clarify whether or not there is a parallel with regard to Jewish congregations having a nationalist, or at least I heard, a nationalist sort of view and being exercised in the community. We can see this in certainly evangelical communities today about for Christians, et cetera, using the United States flag, if you will, and being pro-America and everything like that. Do you see a parallel in this sort of envisioning of a theocratic nationalism, and whether one is helping to conveniently feed another, or parallels, not conspiratorial, but in just terms of social flow, and whether or not they're being used as convenient opportunities to promote state-led violence, frankly, and other things?
Yeah, there's a lot to your question there.
Yeah.
So one piece of it is that Jews historically, in a lot of different settings, have realized that being loyal to whatever regime they lived under was just a good idea for them as a minority. So you can find example of Jewish communities all over the world, you know, doing prayers for the king or the government or the country, or even putting national flags on their synagogues. And we see that in the US too, right? These communities just really performing their loyalty and their patriotism and saying, like, look how good we are as Americans. Sometimes it was like, well, we're the good immigrants as opposed to those guys who are the bad immigrants. Kind of being on the good side of power as opposed to the bad side, and being, for the most part, more visibly white-skinned than other immigrant groups facilitated that in the aftermath of World War II. But at the same time, Jews were always suspicious of anything that would established Christianity as a state religion, right? Jews didn't want there to be like Christian prayer in schools or anything that would infringe on Jews' right to sort of define their practice as they wanted. So I've been very opposed to Christian nationalism. Now these things are coming into some conflict because you have some Jewish communities that are still very much interested in displaying their loyalty to the government, and the fact that the government is pro-Israel says, well, yes, yes, of course, like we are with you, like we are so patriotic. The same time, there's these other aspects of the policy that they seem to be enabling by aligning themselves. So it's a very tricky relationship. And now, I didn't mention this, but I think over the last year, there's been quite the trend of this faction on the right actually turning against Israel. So now there's a you could call it pro-Palestinian MAGA or pro-Palestinian right wing, which is complicated because now you're seeing some Palestinian groups getting really excited when like Tucker Carlson criticizes Israel, and it's like things are getting very scrambled, right? It is not clear. It's not just Democrats versus Republicans or left versus right. There's like a pro-Palestinian side on left and right, and sometimes the pro-Palestinian right wing is saying things about Palestine that leftists really like, but are also saying things about Jews that are really anti-Semitic at the same time. I'll put a plug out for a magazine which also has a podcast called Jewish Currents, which has done a really, yeah, you know it. They've done a great, what's that? Jewish Currents. Jewish Currents is the name of the magazine, and they also have a podcast. I think they've had at least 2 episodes trying to like unpack and understand what it means for there to be this pro-Palestinian right wing. So if you're interested in that, I really recommend. Yeah, he just spoke here last year. He has some kind of like editorial role there. Yeah.
Got a question here.
Thank you, first of all. This is great. And going back for a second to the question about, or the topic of political support for Israel becoming entwined with basic Judaism, there's a great film that I think is available for streaming called Israelism. At least I thought it was great. You might have other comments about it. I'd love to hear. I just found it interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really struck me because this film profiles this woman, Simone Zimmerman, who grew up in LA in a community for which Zionism was very, very central, and then as a younger adult became more aligned with the pro-Palestine cause. I mean, that was my upbringing as well, not in LA. I grew up in the Boston area, but I'm very, very familiar with what's being described, like the way institutions cultivate this love of Israel. I didn't love the film in a lot of ways, but I think it does describe something very, very real, which is the way that whole generations of American Jews sort of came up feeling that this Israel was something to be proud of, something to be connected to, and then sometimes somebody comes and critiques and produces this defensive reaction, like, how could that possibly be true? You must be lying. Some people then work through it, but for others it's very hard, and that's something to be aware of.
Excellent. Just as a reminder, we're at about 10 till 1. And are there any other questions or comments at this stage?
No one else has? 2 questions, both not easy. One, I'll say the first one's I'm more interested to hear what you have to say about AIPAC, which is getting so much attention now.
Right.
And talk about what you were talking about. It's like, oh my God, AIPAC is like representing all these bad things that you're leading to, in my opinion, because they're paying for the elections here. I mean, they're paying politicians to be pro-Palestinian rights. I also want to say that to be pro-Palestinian doesn't necessarily to be anti-Israel. I mean, you can, what I tend to say for myself, the Israel that is now, is not anything I want to be a part of, but if Israel were willing to make big changes and welcome Palestinians.
Yeah, and just on that, I also think being critical of Israel does not mean being critical of all Israelis as people. And that's also really, really important, right? People don't control where they're born. Many people came to Israel, you know, for all sorts of reasons, including as Holocaust refugees or refugees from countries that didn't welcome them. And that's where they're born. And, you know, no one should be blamed for that. And yet it's possible to criticize structures and systems and governments. AIPAC, yeah. So AIPAC began as, you know, really began, I forget what year it was founded, I think 52 or 53, something like that, to advocate for Israel among members of Congress. And then much more recently, it started directly putting money into political campaigns. I think they actually had to create some different like apparatus that was able to be more of like a political PAC type thing. Anyway, in the last 10 years or so, have really focused on putting money into races, including pretty local level races that might not have made big news, to try to support the candidates who were gonna, you know, support aid flowing to Israel and oppose candidates who oppose that. And in some ways, they've had a lot of impact, but in some cases, the folks who they were going against actually have won, which then raises, you know, if you read about Abdul Sayed in Michigan just a couple of weeks ago, they're not always succeeding, right? Money isn't actually powerful enough to buy elections in all cases, even if it does a lot. And AIPAC has become something like a, I don't know, on the one hand, it's a very powerful actor. On the other hand, it's become something of like a bogeyman, like it's sort of the thing named, which I do think has the potential to like run into some of this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory stuff. At the same time, they're putting a lot of money into the elections. So it gets back to this tension and dynamic I was describing earlier.
All right. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Before we get to you, Sue, I wanted just to encourage folks that are online. We'll be closing this out in just a few minutes, but if you want to take a couple of minutes while this next question is being asked, if you have a question to bring into the space here, go ahead and type it into the comment, and Amanda or Platus will relay that to this space. So Sue, what is your question?
It may be because we are here and not in Israel, but it strikes me that the term is used as anti-Israeli, anti-Israel, whereas we would all say, wouldn't use the word anti-American, we'd say anti-Trump.
Well, it depends who you are. Some people
Right,
would say anti-American.
right. But if I wanted to say I disagreed with what's going on, I rarely hear someone say anti-Netanyahu.
Well, plenty of people do.
Right, but I mean, but when I'm hearing the discussion going on, in all reality, I think most of us, and I realize this is about anti-Semitism, the real complaint of what's going on now isn't with the Jewish religion, with Israel, it's with the government in power, just as I may or may not, but do, have complaints with what's going on with my own government in power.
I think this is actually an interesting parallel between US politics and Israeli politics. Is some people really see the system as basically okay, but the leadership as the problem. And therefore, they're very invested in using the political system to change the leadership. You might know that before October 7th, there were months and months of Israeli protests, sort of internally, Jewish-led protests. They're explicitly anti-Netanyahu. And those were people who said, no, this country and this system is like basically good, but has gone the wrong way and it needs to come back. The same thing in the US, right? When we were, when Biden was being elected, or on the Harris campaign, saying this country is basically good, but things have gone the wrong way and we need to elect someone else. But in both cases, you can also see parts of the political spectrum with much more foundational critiques, right? That the system itself is broken, that the system itself was founded on violence. In this country, Native American displacement, slavery, all sorts of, things in Israel, of course, the 1948 Nakba and other things. And sometimes there's big, big tension between the folks who want to critique the system and those who actually think the system is okay and support changed leadership, even if they end up voting the same way in an election. But you drill down, there's a lot of tension internally.
Do we have a question that's come through? Oh, from Platistic, yes. Here you go.
It's actually just related to your comment about the anti-Netanyahu process, of which there are many, and were many even after October 7th. I have many friends and coworkers in Israel. But it is also worth keeping in mind that just for everybody who is attempting to help Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, that likewise in July and August of that year, conditions in Gaza were such that there were actually people finally braving Hamas to protest Hamas. I mean, it was pretty noteworthy. So both sides in power had reasons for wanting to escalate.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we haven't discussed that sort of geopolitical side of things. That would be a whole different conversation. But yes, I mean, there's a lot to be said here. I mean, yeah, Hamas is operating under impossible circumstances, but that doesn't make them like good political actors, right? They were also very cynical actors in many ways and ran a very repressive regime towards multiple groups. We mentioned Christians, but also there were other groups. So yeah, if we want to have that conversation, it's a different one, but thanks for mentioning it.
Okay. Well, we thank you so much for being here, Dr. Halperin.
Thank you.
And we thank everybody who was able to come here today in person, and thank those who have joined us online as well. You can see this recording on our YouTube channel, St. Andrews, Seattle. Thank you.